The needle didn't just spin. It locked itself dead north, then swung to south, then just started shaking like something underneath the glass was trying to get out. That's what a forestry technician named Wade told 3 separate search and rescue teams in the fall of 2019, right before he walked back into the trees alone and didn't come out for 11 hours. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the compasses in this particular stretch of national forest don't just malfunction. They tell you something. And once you know what they're pointing at, you'll never look at a trail map the same way again. I want to be upfront about something. Before I get into this, I'm not a hiker. I'm not the outdoorsy type who goes looking for haunted trailheads for content. I got into this story because I write for a small regional magazine out of the Midwest, the kind that covers county fairs and local history, and the occasional missing hiker piece when nothing bigger is going on. In the spring of 2021, my editor sent me out to a place I'm going to call the Ash Grove National Forest, because the real name doesn't matter, and the rangers who talked to me asked that I not use it. It sits across parts of 2 states, mostly hardwood and pine, crossed by old logging roads that were cut sometime before the Second World War and never fully mapped again after that. The assignment was simple. Write 800 words about search and rescue volunteers and the difficulty of the terrain. That was it. I drove up on a Tuesday in April, stayed at a motel off Route 9 that charged $41 a night, and had a coffee maker bolted to the nightstand. And the next morning, I met a ranger named Wade at the district office. He was maybe 55, thick through the shoulders, the kind of guy who'd clearly spent 30 years outside and looked every year of it. I asked him the standard questions. How many rescues a year? What usually goes wrong? What people do that gets them lost? He answered all of it professionally, like he'd said it 100 times to reporters like me. Then I asked him, almost as an afterthought, if there was any part of the forest that gave the search teams more trouble than the rest. He got quiet for a second. Then he said there was a section, maybe 4 square miles, up near a ridge the old timber crews used to call Hollow Iron, where compasses don't behave. Not don't work, don't behave. I laughed, because I thought he was setting up some folksy local legend for the article, the kind of color quote editors love. He didn't laugh back. He said he wasn't joking, and that if I wanted, he'd show me on a topo map exactly where it started and exactly where it stopped, because the boundary was that precise. He'd walked it himself, he said, more than once, holding a compass in each hand. I want to explain what he showed me, because it's the detail that changed this from a quirky local color piece into something I couldn't stop thinking about. He pulled a laminated topographic map off the wall, the kind with elevation lines and old fire road numbers on it, and he traced a rough oval with his finger, an area bounded roughly by Forest Road, 118 on one side, and a dry creek bed on the other. Inside that oval, he said, a compass needle will drift. Not randomly. It pulls toward the center of the oval, no matter what direction you're actually walking. Step outside the boundary, even by 10 feet, and the needle snaps back to true north like nothing happened. He'd tested it himself with 3 different compasses from 3 different manufacturers, plus a compass app on 2 different phones, because he assumed at first it had to be something in one particular instrument. a manufacturing flaw, or a magnetized case. All 5 gave him the same result, the same pull, the same boundary line down to a few feet. I asked him the obvious question, whether there was iron ore or some kind of mineral deposit under that ridge, because that's the explanation you'd want to reach for first. Magnetite deposits really do exist in parts of the country, and they really can throw off a compass. He said the Forest Service had wondered the same thing back in the 70s and brought in a geologist to survey it. The geologist found nothing. No unusual mineral content. No metal deposits. Nothing in the soil or bedrock that should do what that ground was doing to a compass needle. The report, Wade said, is still in a filing cabinet somewhere at the district office, 3 pages long, ending with a sentence he'd apparently memorized because he quoted it to me without looking anything up. The report said, and I'm paraphrasing what he told me rather than reading it myself, that the anomaly could not be explained by any known geological process in the study area, and that further investigation was not recommended. That phrase stuck with me. Further investigation was not recommended, not because they'd solved it, because somebody, back in 1976 or whenever it was, decided they didn't want to know more. Wade offered to take me up there himself, on the record, so I could get a photo for the piece of a compass doing what he described. I said yes before I really thought it through, because at that point, I was thinking like a reporter, not like someone who was about to spend an afternoon in a patch of forest. That had apparently earned the phrase, further investigation was not recommended. We drove out along Forest Road 118 in his truck, then hiked in maybe half a mile from a pull-off with no sign, just a gap in the tree line that locals apparently knew by word of mouth. The day was clear, upper 50s, the kind of unremarkable spring weather where nothing feels like it's building toward anything. About 20 minutes in, Wade stopped and pointed at a spot on the ground, no different from any other spot, just leaf litter and a fallen branch, and said this was roughly where the boundary started. He handed me his compass. I held it flat like he showed me, walked forward maybe 15 feet past where he was standing, and watched the needle swing off true north and settle, pointing back the way we'd come, deeper into the trees, not toward Wade, not toward the truck, toward something further in. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't spin or shake the way he'd described from the incident with the search teams. It just quietly, calmly, pointed somewhere it had no reason to point, and held there, steady, like it had made up its mind. I want to tell you honestly that my first reaction wasn't fear. It was this strange kind of embarrassment, like I'd caught a piece of the natural world doing something it wasn't supposed to do, and I didn't know where to look. Wade watched my face and said something I didn't fully understand until later. He said, "Most people think it's random. It's not random. It always points the same direction, no matter where in the boundary you're standing." I asked him what was in that direction. He said there wasn't a trail, wasn't a landmark on any map, wasn't a water source or a rock formation, just more forest, sloping down toward a low area the old logging surveys marked simply as Section 14, unnamed otherwise. Nobody logged it, he said. The 1930s timber crews cut all around it and left that one section alone, and there was no paperwork explaining why. We were maybe 40 minutes from the truck when Wade's radio crackled with a call from another ranger. something routine about a downed tree on a different road, and he had to take it. He told me to wait exactly where I was standing, not to walk further in, and he'd be back in 10 minutes once he relayed a message back to the office. I said, "Fine." I stood there in a patch of ordinary-looking hardwood forest, holding a compass that was pointing at a direction with nothing in it, and I waited. 10 minutes came and went, then 20. I want to be precise about what happened next because I've told this part of the story to exactly 4 people since then, and every time I tell it, I try to strip out anything that sounds embellished, because I don't need it to sound scarier than it was. What it was this. The forest got quiet in a way that felt specific rather than natural. I don't mean peaceful. I mean the kind of quiet where you noticed there had been sound a moment before, and now there wasn't. The way you notice a refrigerator hum, only after it stops. No birds. No wind moving the leaves, even though I could see branches further off still moving slightly, like the stillness was centered on me, and thinning out the farther you got from where I stood, and the compass in my hand, which had been steady and quiet for 20 minutes, started to shake. Not spin. Shake, the way a plate shakes right before it falls off a table. A fast, small vibration that I could feel in my palm through the plastic housing. Wade came back at that exact moment, jogging slightly, apologizing for taking longer than he said, and he stopped mid-sentence when he saw my face, and then he looked down at the compass in my hand and went very still himself. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he said quietly, almost gently, "We should head back to the truck now," in a tone that wasn't panicked, but also wasn't the tone of a man narrating a fun local oddity for a magazine article anymore. We didn't run. I want to be clear about that. Because in the story, people tell each other later there's always running, and there wasn't any here, at least not from me. Wade walked fast, in a straight line he clearly knew by memory rather than by compass, since his own compass by that point was doing the same shaking thing mine was. It took maybe 15 minutes to get back to the truck, and every one of those minutes felt longer than it should have, the way time does when you're paying very close attention to every sound you're not hearing. When we crossed back over whatever that boundary was, I felt it more than saw it. The compass needle just stopped shaking, snapped back to a normal, boring, correct, true north. And at almost the same moment, I heard a bird somewhere off to my left, ordinary and unbothered, like it had been there the whole time, and I'd simply stopped being able to hear it. Wade didn't want to talk in the truck. We drove back to the district office mostly in silence, and it was only once we were sitting in his office with the door closed that he told me the rest of it, the part he apparently didn't tell most reporters, the part that made the earlier story about the search and rescue crews mean something different than I'd first understood it to mean. The incident I mentioned at the start, from 2019, wasn't a case of someone getting lost. Wade had been part of that search himself. A hiker named Ellis, a man in his 60s from 2 counties over, had gone in on a day trip he'd done dozens of times before. A simple loop trail nowhere near the hollow iron boundary, at least according to the map. He didn't come back that evening. Search teams went in the next morning and found his day pack, his water bottle, and his compass sitting neatly stacked on a flat rock inside the boundary, nearly a mile off the trail he was supposed to be on, in a direction that made no sense given where he'd started. The compass, when they picked it up, was pointing in that same fixed direction Wade had shown me, toward Section 14. Ellis himself was found 11 hours later, 4 miles away, on the opposite side of the forest, sitting against a tree, alive, uninjured, but unable to explain how he'd covered that distance, or why his boots showed no matching wear pattern for that kind of walk. When they asked him what happened, he told them he remembered walking toward something he described only as a clearing that smelled like rain, even though it hadn't rained in 10 days. And past that, he said, he genuinely did not remember anything until the moment searchers found him. Wade told me the Forest Service doesn't publicize any of this, not because of some grand cover-up, but because there's nothing official to say. No crime was committed. No one was hurt. The Geological Survey found nothing. There's no incident report category for a compass that behaves like it's being asked to. And there's no polite way to write in a federal report that a grown man walked 4 miles in 11 hours and can't remember why. So the story just lives the way stories like this always live, in what a handful of rangers tell each other, and occasionally, carefully, tell a reporter who happens to ask the right question at the right moment. Before I left that day, I asked Wade the question I'd been sitting on since the moment my own compass started shaking in my hand. I asked him if he had any theory at all, even one he wasn't sure of, about what was actually happening out there. He thought about it for a long time before he answered. Long enough that I assumed he was going to tell me he didn't want to speculate on the record. Instead, he said something I've turned over in my head more times than I can count since then. He said he didn't think the compass was malfunctioning at all. He thought it was doing exactly what it was built to do, which is point toward the strongest pull in the field around it. He said maybe somewhere under Section 14, in that one patch of forest the loggers left standing for reasons nobody wrote down, there's something that pulls harder than the magnetic pole does. And the only reason we call it a malfunction, he said, is because we assume the compass is wrong, instead of assuming it's telling us the truth about a place we don't have a name for yet. I never went back to Hollow Iron. I wrote my 800 words about search and rescue volunteers, and I left out almost everything I've just told you, because at the time, I didn't think a regional farm and lifestyle magazine was the place for it. And honestly, I wasn't sure I believed my own memory of that afternoon enough to put it in print. But I kept the compass. Wade gave it to me, actually, at the end of that conversation, sliding it across his desk and telling me he had others. I still have it in a drawer in my apartment, and every so often, usually late at night for no particular reason, I'll take it out and just hold it. And it works exactly the way a compass should, pointing true north, steady and boring and correct, the way it's supposed to everywhere except one small patch of trees I have no intention of ever walking into again. What stays with me isn't the fear of it, honestly. It's something closer to grief, though I know that sounds like an odd word to use here. Ellis walked 4 miles towards something he can't remember, and came back changed in ways nobody can quite name. And Wade has spent decades of his career carrying a piece of knowledge he can't do anything official with. And there's a patch of ground. The loggers themselves were apparently afraid enough to leave alone, and none of it resolves into an answer. It just sits there, the way certain places in this country sit there, quietly outside the edges of what we've mapped and measured and explained, waiting for the next person who wanders in a little too far off the trail. I think that's the part that actually unsettles me, more than any single detail. Not that the forest might be haunted or magnetic or strange. It's that some places don't owe us an explanation, no matter how many instruments we point at them. If you've ever stood somewhere and felt like the ground itself was steering you, somewhere a device stopped trusting itself, the same way I stopped trusting mine that afternoon, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Tell me where it was, and tell me what you were holding on to when it happened. I'll be reading every one of them.